So March 2021 marked the 1-year anniversary of when COVID-19 hit the Irish shores. It has changed life to what we once knew it to be. There's new social norms that have come in place which have changed the way the public behaves in order to suppress the virus. What has happened in this case, the government have enforced new restrictions and guidelines for the public to follow. For example, measures have been put in place, such as not mixing with other households, closing all non-essential retail and restaurants for the foreseeable future. And as well as that, it's mandatory to wear a face mask in an indoor setting and even public transport. So it makes us question, now that we are in a year into COVID, are the Irish people adhering to the rules as they once were a year ago? Kays Kaiser did a study and he discovered that when a person is observing another person, or in fact a social group, causing disorder, they're more likely to do the same. This behaviour is also reiterated in the broken windows theory. When a sign of disorder is shown, it usually is followed by a disordered behaviour. So we've now seen this in the third lockdown quite a lot, where in fact the government guidelines are in place, but people aren't following them as well as you would have liked. We are seeing like a lack of social distancing, a lack of wearing masks, and also large gatherings on social media, which is evident.
The broken windows theory, which was established by James Wilson and George Kelly in 1982, is clear in the research being carried out by government departments. They claimed that those who believed others were less compliant to guidelines were themselves more likely to have close contacts.
So we sat down with Shane Timmins, who happens to be a researcher in the behaviour unit in the Economic Social Research Institute. So we wanted to ask him why people aren't adhering to COVID guidelines as well as they were in the first lockdown. We sat down with him on a Zoom call to see what he had to say. Do you think there's a change in people's behaviours in adhering to the guidelines?
Yeah, I think we saw an extremely high level of compliance with the guidelines during the first lockdown, so during around April last year. I would imagine this is driven primarily from two factors. One is that people are highly worried about the virus, and the second is that we were in a very uncertain situation. So when we're facing a good deal of uncertainty, and we get guidance from an authority source like NPHET or the government, you might be more likely to follow those rules than when you feel like you have a better grasp of the situation. So I think right now we've lived with the virus for about a year, so people kind of might feel like they have more certainty about how they should behave and so on. What I would add to that though is that we do see high levels of worry driving behaviour still. So I think compliance is still quite high, not as high as we were this time last year, but I don't think that compliance has fallen away completely.
We were also joined by Ailbhe Mulcahy, who happens to be a professor in the School of Sociology in UCD. We wanted to talk to him about the behaviours that have happened with COVID-19 and as well as the crime that has come with it in people adhering to the new government guidelines that are enforced by the Gardaí.
My sense is that there probably is less adherence at this stage, and I put that down really to probably what people would call fatigue. Just a sense of tiredness, exhaustion, frustration. But I still, if I was surprised by anything, I'm surprised really by the level of adherence. I'm surprised by the extent to which people do, out of the glare of the police, out of the glare of any security apparatus, that they do generally seem to follow the guidelines.
With COVID fatigue and frustration rising from the public, it is evident why compliance is slipping. It was reported that 36% of Irish people believe that Ireland is returning to normal at a slow pace. This has increased by 25% since January 2021.
The broken windows theory suggests that if someone breaks a rule, others will follow. And we can see this in social media, which has become such a big part in our lives since COVID has hit. We can see that on Snapchat stories, perhaps, or even Instagram stories, that people are attending large public gatherings. People take pictures of one another, of not adhering to the government guidelines. This can also be an example of same norm inhibition, where someone breaks a rule that's already been broken.
Instances of non-compliance are going to stand out to people more than instances of compliance, firstly because you can see it more. You can't see the people who are sitting inside their houses. You can see the people who are outside potentially breaking the rules. So firstly, when we see these things happening more, there's something called the availability heuristic in psychology that suggests that you're going to start to think that this is happening more frequently just because you can see it more often. So you don't have the base rate of compliance there to compare it against. This naturally then can be amplified on social media, and I think it's happened quite a lot where there's one instance of non-compliance that's taken as an example and it's spread over social media, and then you risk people thinking that this is more commonplace than it is. Like, I can readily think of a few examples of situations where it was students in Galway, for example, who were breaking the rules. And then the more readily you can think of these examples, the more likely it is you think that people are not following the rules. And then, as you say, you might start to think, well, what's the point in me doing it? Most people are what we call conditional cooperators. I'm happy to make the sacrifices for the greater good as long as I think everyone else is. If you're not going to do it, then why should I? So we do risk on social media making people think that others are complying less than in fact they are.
Despite levels of compliance dropping, most of the population are still adhering to guidelines. This was acknowledged by the Principal Officer of the Department of Health, Kate O'Flaherty, who happened to be the Head of Health and Wellbeing at the Department of Health and a member of NPHET as of October 2020 last year. NPHET is a team of medical experts and health service chiefs who have been overseeing the response to COVID-19 and advising the government on precautions the public should be taking.
And I think that sense of kind of empathy and understanding and community, we try to bring that across in our community and always focus on what the majority are doing, because in adhering to public health guidance, it's really about doing as best you can most of the time. So it's not about if everyone doing 100% of everything 100% of the time. And I suppose because it's going on for so long, and as you say, people are feeling mentally drained and fed up of it, it's having that sense of hope and encouragement to say, well, you know, you're doing your best, you know what to do, or you're sure you know what to do. And I remember, like, when we brought in like guidance around mask wearing on buses and stuff, and there was kind of people going to college and secondary school, and you know, people were like, will they bother? Will they know what to do? Will they know how to wear a mask? Will they, you know, just say, I'm not doing this? But because I was getting the bus in and out of the office when I was in, and you know, from day one, every young person on the bus was wearing their mask perfectly, you know. So, but sometimes we don't focus enough on the positives of how well people were adhering. So, because, you know, when you're dealing with a virus and a pandemic, like, you look at the population, so you're not looking at what every single person's doing. If enough people do enough of the good stuff and keep it going, that keeps the population safe. But I think we're dealing with a different population now, because a year ago, people would have really relied on us to tell them what to do or give them information. But people now have their own set, if you like, of knowledge and skills and tools. People obviously, with particularly with social media, like, are getting information from all over the world, and they're making their own judgments and have their own information bank now about how they want to behave and what they want to do.
It's quite evident that people's attitudes toward government guidelines are changing all the time. This was done in a study in April 2021 with Mark, where it was shown that there was a 5% drop in people not wearing masks. There was also 30% of people who did the survey believed that it was a 50-50 chance that people would adhere to government guidelines. However, all these not adhering to the restrictions has impacted the hospitals greatly and affected them most of all. We're now going to do an interview with Farrell, who is a nurse in ICU in Tallaght, who will tell us all about it.
Some people are doing great and they still are complying, and they're doing really well to try to keep the virus at bay. But then there is other people who think, no, if they see other people doing it, they're like, oh, if they're doing it, it's okay, I'll do it as well. So there definitely is a lot less lack of compliance than there was during the first wave. You have to make that decision at the end of the day. Like, is this something that I really need to do to meet up with other people? Is it worth the consequence in terms of the burden of illness that you're going to get and see in the weeks after? And it is difficult to make those decisions if you see other people doing it, and if you're not aware of the consequences of the virus and what that has on your life and on others, and also spreading it to others.
The social activity measure behavioural study carried out by the Department of the Taoiseach and the ERSI's Behavioural Research Unit in March 2021 stated that over 80% of social visits were held indoors, with most people reporting that they did not wear masks or ensured that the room was well ventilated.
Yeah, I do think the vaccine has given some hope and some kind of reassurance to the public, like that there is an end to this. But I think some people need to realise as well that the vaccine isn't the only thing that's going to work. Like, you still need to wear masks, because you're still at risk of contracting COVID even with having had the vaccine. Especially people think after your first dose, oh, I'm fine now. You still have to have the 2 doses of whichever vaccine that you receive to be fully kind of vaccinated against it. But you still need to comply with the guidelines, wear your mask, wash your hands, because that does have a direct impact on other people who may not be vaccinated as well.
We are also joined by Dara Rody, who happens to be a manager in a local spar shop in South County Dublin. We wanted to talk to him about the restrictions that are in place in the shop and also how customers have responded to them.
There's a little green area just down by the dart station behind Spar. There'll be people posting social media. They're down in the green area down behind Spar, just by the seafront there. I suppose the more people who see that Instagram story, the more people are going to flock down. Our drink sales are just through the roof because everyone's going down there drinking, but at the same time they've nowhere else to go. So,
have you had any incidents yourself in the store where a customer has not shown compliances with these guidelines?
Yeah, there's been a few. Yeah, some people throw their toys out of the pram when you ask them to wear a mask. Some people claim that they can't wear for medical reasons, which is fair. We have no other way of kind of proving otherwise. Then some people just blatantly just don't want to wear a mask, and there can be altercations. One not so long ago, one of my colleagues tried to tell a group of guys to put on masks, and they hurled abuse at her, and there's really nothing you can do in that instance, to be honest with you.
Researchers found that non-compliance was higher among males. They also highlighted that higher non-compliance in men is an important statistic, given that mortality rates from COVID-19 were higher amongst men at the time.
Lads some of them just come in and don't wear their masks, shouting around the shop and stuff like that, especially in big groups as well. It's the whole thing of group dynamics. If there's a big group of lads, they're less likely to adhere to the guidelines.
So a lot has changed in the last year. A lot of new rules have come in, such as social distancing and hand sanitizing. For example, this isn't allowed anymore. We're no longer able to do this, but new measures such as face masks that have been brought in have been enforced within our country. So, how exactly are the government and NPHET going to enforce these rules that people stick to them and adhere to them on a regular basis?
There's only so much you can do. They've enforced the mask policy. It's a tough thing to enforce, especially when we can't really question the people for having kind of an underlying condition. I mean, they can claim that they have an underlying condition and they don't have to wear a mask, but we have no way of proving it. The screens are there. I don't think there's a huge amount they really can do to protect us, but I mean, I've gotten so used to it now, I feel safe working in the shop, but that's not to say that they've done the most to make me feel safe. It's just I've gotten used to it now at this stage.
When individuals see others breaking a restriction, such as going outside of their 5K, they may be tempted to break a different guideline, such as not wearing a mask in public places. This is known as the cross-norm inhibition effect, which is when a broken norm triggers a person to break a different norm. This could also be due to a lack of perceived punishment.
So COVID-19 restrictions have been in place in Ireland for the majority of the last year. How are Irish people going to be ensured that there's going to be light at the end of the tunnel? And how are they going to stick to the rules that have been put in place for them? And perhaps, should the guards be given more power to enforce these rules so that people stick to them?
Yeah, so this is actually something we considered ourselves. So whether people thought the threat of rule enforcement might be a driver of behavior. So we knew that there were fines that people would get if they went outside of their 5K, for example, or fines if you organized an event, or fines if you attended, say, a house party or something along those lines. So those are the rules that have kind of been in over the last while. In the social activity measure that we've been running, we asked kind of towards the end of it how likely people thought they would be to get caught and to receive a fine if they broke multiple types of rules. We then checked to see whether people who thought that was more likely were more likely to break rules or to not comply with guidelines. And actually what we found until the last wave is that there was absolutely no relationship between how likely you thought it was that you're going to receive a punishment and the behavior you were doing. In the last wave, there's been an indication that, so the last wave covered the end of March, there was an indication that people who thought they were more likely to get a fine were less likely to meet up with others. But it was a really small effect. So there actually doesn't seem to be too much of a relationship there between that sort of legal enforcement and that sort of punishment and behavior. Where punishment, however, might become more important is the kind of subtler, more social forms of punishment. So if it's disapproved from the larger group, if your behavior is disapproved from the larger group, then you might be more likely to imply. So there's an entire literature in behavioral economics on what are called collective action problems. So these are problems where everyone needs to sacrifice a little bit in order for the group to be better off. And in those instances, punishment is actually seen to be one of the better drivers of compliance and coordination. But that punishment can be as simple as everyone else in the group kind of disapproving of the non-compliant behavior.
If you gave the police more powers, well, first of all, the powers they have, I think they certainly emphasize that they were reluctant to use those powers. In other words, that they would prefer compliance and persuasion rather than, sanction and punishment. And I think that's very important in something like this. Again, just think of the phenomenon we're dealing with. It's not that people necessarily have done something wrong and therefore they're being punished by going into their homes. It's that you've done nothing wrong, but because of the pandemic, we have to ask you to restrict your behavior.
So Kushnig and Wolverine suggest that self-interest is a strong factor of someone's behavior, and people will only adhere to rules to avoid sanction.
Given that you're asking so many people to make so many sacrifices, when people, have ostentatious parties or, hey, let's all have a rave. The fact of the matter is that rave is not it's not going to affect just the people who attend. It's going to affect the people who attend, who then go home to their houses, who then are involved in chains of interaction with lots of other people. So if they're going to say, well, it's really important for me in my life to be up all night listening to, whatever boombox I have, then I don't have any difficulty whatsoever with the sanction being applied. And that also goes for, the ludicrous examples of non-compliance from people who think they're above the law. So no, a bit of me smiles when I see egregious breaches of the guidelines being met with sanction. But I think for something like this, as a broad principle, you're relying on persuasion. You're relying on people's own sense of responsibility and people's own willingness to adjust to the situation and to the challenges it poses.
Especially after Christmas, people kind of relaxed a lot, and then the numbers immediately spiked afterwards. And there's still people in ICU that have been there since Christmas, and they're very, very, very slow to recover. It's from this third wave compared to the second and the first wave. First wave, people recovered a lot quicker. Second wave, a little bit slower, but not as bad as this third wave. People are very slow.
So what can the government and NPHET do to encourage the Irish people to stick with the rules they have put in place?
What we have seen with social media is quite a lot of outrage at these instances where people say, no, that is not acceptable. And that kind of message can actually be a strong motivator of compliance when everyone sees that, that's actually, no one approves of this behavior, no one approves of us meeting up outside, there's something wrong with this. That can help kind of control things, but where that outrage is coming from is important. So it can't be all of the older people looking down on all of the younger people, for example. You need it to be coming from within the group.
Although disorder may be highly unwelcomed in a pandemic, it can actually increase signs of collective efficacy. Disorder cues not only trigger disorderly behaviour, but also encourage people to do the opposite. Individuals may speak out against the pro-social behaviour for the good of the country.
But we've also seen a decrease in worry over the last while. And worry, from what we've done, is the strongest predictor of behaviour. So you had just asked people on a scale of 1 to 10, how worried are you about the virus? And that's the strongest predictor of how compliant they are. And we've seen that at a population level is currently decreasing. And it's getting down towards the levels it was back last July when we had about 6 cases a day, even though we have 300 to 400 cases a day. So what's causing that drop in worry, I think, could be multiple factors. One of them is probably vaccine rollout, that the people that you're most concerned about getting the virus might be vaccinated now, so you're going to become less worried. So it's certainly a possibility, but I can't say for sure. Unfortunately, we don't have the data on that.
So it's quite evident that there is the broken windows theory in Irish society as we currently speak. So we're seeing that now where the people aren't adhering to the rules as well as they were in the first lockdown. And now in the third lockdown, there's more rules being broken where people going outside of their bubble, not wearing face masks and so on. So this is having a huge effect, as we can see, with the essential and frontline workers, which is having a major impact on their jobs. However, there is light at the end of the tunnel, as we can see, where there's a greater vaccine rollout, ICU numbers are decreasing, and as well as the deaths most of all, which hopefully we'll learn perhaps to live with COVID and what new norms will say. And thank you for listening to our documentary.